So, our speaker today is Iuliia Glushneva. She is currently a GTA in Film and Media Studies here at KU. She's a Fulbright graduate student studying here, earning her master's degree in that department, and she holds an undergraduate and graduate degree in history and philosophy from the Siberian Federal University in Russia. Her academic interests include contemporary theory, philosophy of cinema, film phenomenology, and post-Soviet Russian cinema. So we're very happy to have her here talking about it.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to Chris for allowing me to talk today. It's a great pleasure for me to come. What I would like to talk to you about is a part of my ongoing research on phenomenological theories of film experience. Specifically, I'm interested in theories of embodied spectatorship, which help us understand how our body reacts to film and how cinema can represent the unrepresentable senses such as smell, taste, touch, and so forth. I would like to emphasize here and calm you down beforehand that it's not going to be a lecture on biology and physiology. When I talk about body and senses, first of all, I consider body as a cultural and social phenomenon, as a specific source of knowledge and as one of our instruments to approach the world and reality. What I'm going to discuss today is two films. They are Repentance, directed by Georgian film director Tengiz Abuladze and released in 1984. And the second film is Khrustalev, My Car, made by Russian director Alexei in 1998. Our goal is to talk about how these films evoke sensuous experience and how, and more importantly, how this experience can be understood through the prism of memory about the Soviet past. First of all, why these films? What is the rationale for such a choice? Watching Repentance, and especially Khrustalev, My Car, has become one of the most uncomfortable film experiences in my life. And on the one hand, this is because these films have very intricate narrative structure, and this structure is barely recognized sometimes. But on the other hand, this is because these films very disturbing in physical sense. They provide a provocative sensuous experience where feelings of disgust, fear, and anxiety are almost unbearable. And I used to think that my reaction to these films was just mechanical, and what I felt is just my cognitive response to the story and artistic strategies Abuladze and German use. But after showing Khrustalev, My Car to one of my American professors here at KU, I realized that the reason is completely different. We watched this film together, and I saw how this film seemed to be comical and funny for my professor. And so, yeah, it was quite unexpectedly. But this is not because she was a bad person, of course, not. This is not the reason. The reason is that she wasn't able to connect the film to her own memory and her own cultural environment. And I realized that Khrustalev, My Car was so disturbing for me because the representation of the past in this film didn't coincide with my concept of the Soviet past. And I realized that this concept was created by official and normative histories, and these normative histories created a strong contrast with what I saw in Khrustalev, My Car. And I was born in the Soviet Union, but I have never lived there. And the only way how I can get access to the Soviet past is through this text, through official texts presented by historical texts, cultural texts, including literary works and films, of course. But as we all understand, these texts are not free from nostalgia, and often they have this sacral status. For this reason, I just think that Repentance and Khrustalev, My Car, challenge the official discourses, the official histories created in Russia and in the Soviet Union specifically. What such films do is that they destabilize our classical conventional perception of this past, and they do this by means of defamiliarization of the past, and they achieve this defamiliarized effect by two ways. The first one is that they appeal to trope of personal memory, memories that cannot always match, at least, official histories. And there is always a gap between our individual memory and official explanation of the events. What is also interesting here for both of these films is that Repentance and Khrustalev, My Car appeal to memory of a child. So in both cases, we see what happens in the films through the prism of child's memories. And a child is not just a metaphor, but a figure which is outside of broad social space. The child cannot operate with social symbols and submit to social standards in a full sense. So for this reason, his or her, child's memories provide a contrast with the knowledge we all share. Second, the destabilizing effect produced by Repentance and Khrustalev, My Car, is caused by rejection of logos-centric vision of history. Memory is quite unstable information, and the process of remembrance is not free from fantasy. Moreover, it's not separable from our body, from our corporeal experience. And as Henri Bergson wanted to show, memory is embodied in senses. Sometimes to remember something, we need to recall our physical feelings. And for this reason, we cannot consider memory outside of this discussion about sensuous dimension. And this is what Repentance to a lesser extent and Khrustalev, My Car to a greater extent do. They challenge the dominant way to represent the past through rationalized narrative and recognizable imagery. Instead, they are full of temporal and spatial inconsistencies. They subvert language and evoke the corporeal, the physical, through images of death, food, violence, and through special cinematic techniques, which remind us of materiality of film itself. Before we go on to the question about how these films appeal to embodied memory and what it can mean for us as spectators, I'll remind you some basic plot events in these films and outline the historical circumstances in which those films were produced. So, as I said, Repentance and Khrustalev directly employ the trope of memory, and their entire narrative and visual system is structured around this idea of memory. Repentance is a multi-layered story. So it opens with the scenes in the house of a woman who decorates cakes, and she seems to be a baker. and she listens to a man reading the obituary of mayor of their town. The next scene is a funeral of Mayor Varlam Aravidze. This last name, Aravidze, means any man or every man in the Georgian language. And here in this scene of the funeral, we see Aravidze's family. This is his son, Abel, his daughter-in-law, and his grandson, Tornike, who plays extremely important role in this film. The most interesting begins when, after the funeral, Varlam's family finds his dead body in the garden of their houses, and they find his corpse over and over every day. And it turns out that a person who digs out Varlam's corpse is that woman from the opening scene, the baker, and her name is Katie Baratelli. Katie Baratelli, at her trial, tells her story and explains why she will not allow Varlam to rest. Her story is child's memories about how Varlam Aravadze destroyed the life of her family and destroyed the life of her family when arrested Katie's parents. And this flashback within the film is a clear reference to the terror of the Soviet 30s. So there is no any doubts about this. And Abuladze is very articulate about this reference. And this flashback constitutes the core of the film. Katie's story deeply touches Tornike, Varlam's grandson, and he commits a suicide. Tornike's father, Abel, who has always shut his eyes to Varlam's crimes and tried to justify him, unearths his body and throws it out. Suddenly, in the end of the film, we return to the opening scene in the baker's house, and we find ourselves in this circle and realize that perhaps the entire film was just Katie's daydream. Khrustalev, my car. Alexander Etkin, one of the most respectable scholars who devoted a lot of works and a lot of books and articles to Alexei German, called Khrustalev, My Car the most important film of post-Soviet memory. Unlike Repentance, where memory is one of the three narrative layers, this film is completely based on memories, partially imaginary ones. The entire film is an act of remembrance, and we see all events through the prism of Alyosha Klenski's memories. Alyosha Klenski, son of the main character, who remembers events of 1953, the year that occurred in 1953, the year when Stalin died, and this year as well, Alyosha's father was, who was military doctor, was arrested and sent to Gulag. On his way to Gulag, Klenski was raped, and quite unexpectedly after this, Klenski is freed and taken to die in Stalin. And his task is to save him, but of course Klenski is helpless, and Stalin dies. Klenski doesn't come back to his family, and he just disappears. In the end of film, we see him working as a conductor on a train, and he's broken and absolutely degraded. Both films have become symbols of de-Stalinization and played extremely important cultural role in different ways, however. And both films have very difficult fate. Repentance became the last film of Tengiz Abuladze. He decided to shoot it after a car accident in the early 80s. And Eduard Shevardnadze, who was a secretary of the Georgian Communist Party at that time, supported him and guaranteed Abuladze protection from censorship. In spite of this, Abuladze, as members of his team remember, was anxious about the consequences of this film. In the middle of filming, one of the leading actors was accused of airplane hijacking, and Abuladze was forced to stop filming and reshoot many scenes after resuming. In 1984, Repentance was finally finished, and as you can guess, it was immediately banned. 3 years later, however, in 1987, this film was released again, and it won 3 awards at the Cannes Film Festival. It was screened around the Soviet Union and got absolutely complimentary reviews. And Abuladze received the Order of Lenin for this film and was invited to accompany Mikhail Gorbachev on his visit to New York City. And this fact that release of Repentance in 1987 was celebrated by critics and party activists wasn't surprising. That year marked out the turning point in the movement of freedom of speech in the Soviet Union, and this movement, as you remember, was called Glasnost. And for the first time, Mikhail Gorbachev openly declared the necessity of the policy of Glasnost in 1986. So Repentance, for many people, became a symbol of Glasnost, became a symbol of this freedom to speak. And it's interesting that the Soviet Union's Central Institute for Film Research initiated a special study for the films which could be considered indicators of perestroika, new reforms. And Repentance was the first film selected by the Institute for this research. And now you see reactions of some critics here. For example, Tatiana Hlaplenkina writes that the release of Repentance is one of those big events that certify the order of our life is happily and inevitably changing. At the same time, there is another reaction. The film Repentance is both a sign of the times and itself a fact of the moral purification of society, of courageous openness. Indeed, Repentance was a brave film, but for me, frankly speaking, it wasn't a symbol of Glasnost. This word Glasnost refers to the word voice. But voice of Abuladze was sanctioned by party leaders, and they allowed him to speak. Just take a look at one of the excerpts from the document released by SENSUOUS Inform Kino. It says, the film Repentance is not only an outstanding work of cinema art, but an important event in our social life. Its political significance is so great that all ideological organizations should participate in the work on this film. It's desirable that the explanatory and advertising campaign be led by propagandists and instructors from the party Obkom, Gorkom, and Komsomol in each city. So you see, voice of Repentance was still under the state control. It was in the context of the processes that was going on at that time. But what this film really signifies is an opportunity to remember, and more importantly, to remember independently from official history and directives. It was a film about personal remembrance, about a subject who wasn't a part of collective unity anymore. And this is what was important at that time. If Repentance is a film about freedom of remembering, Khrustalev is a film about inability to articulate memories of the Soviet past. The nature of these memories doesn't allow us to find some proper language to talk about these memories. Alexei German had been working on this film for 7 years before it was released in 1998. Like Repentance, Khrustalev My Car was included in the program of the Cannes Film Festival, but it wasn't accepted by the audience. It was a total failure, and only later, due to critics of the most respected journals and newspapers, the film gained its cult status. In Russia, Khrustalev My Car was recognized as one of the most important films made in post-Soviet Russia, but of course the mass audience didn't respond to this film. What is notable is that today in Russia we witness the revival of interest to this film and Alexei German in particular. So today something interesting is happening with his figure and with his cultural status in Russian space. Repentance and Khrustalev My Car are films that have a lot of differences, but we are going to focus on their similarities in the interaction with viewer. And as I said earlier, this interaction is based on strong sensuous connection between the films and the spectator. And this connection is provided by, first of all, deconstruction of language, and second, by specific imagery. As for deconstruction of language, first of all, it manifests itself in destruction of narrative mode. Narrative mode is perceived as a core feature of language. I mean, a language in common sense. Language is a strict system with strict rules. I just brought this quotation from Frank Anker-Smith's work on historical experience, where he writes that we have language in order not to have experience. Language is a shield protecting us against the terrors of direct contact with the world as conveyed by experience. So the symbolic status of language, this opportunity to operate with symbols and signs can save us from this terror of reality Anker-Smith mentions here. And what Repentance and Khrustalev My Car do, first of all, is that they deprive us of this opportunity to operate with symbols, to understand, to recognize those symbols. As for the narrative structure of Khrustalev is totally discontinued. The experience of the film, in fact, becomes a downfall in pre-reflexive state, where when the viewer cannot respond to the film text critically. Sometimes we even don't understand what happens on the screen and what kind of events we see. Quite often we just mechanically absorb the visual imagery of the film and don't understand the logic of text. In this regard, Natalia Serivlia says that this film, Khrustalev, My Car, expropriates a part of our nature vision by separating it from thought and action, and by doing so, it commits an act of almost physical violence. So she sees, she articulates this feeling of physical violence, this physical influence through her analysis of this deconstruction of narrative and this strict flow of narration. As for Repentance, we deal with less radical deconstruction of narrative, but still, as one of critics noted, this film is like a matryoshka. So, because it's a story within a story within a story, and it becomes even more intricate if we add dreams and hallucinations in this structure. Repentance, in its narrative system, follows the best traditions of magic realism and surrealism, where reality again loses its recognizable symbols. What is important here is that the spectator's participation in making meaning out of incoherent, disruptive film text can turn into a process of unmaking of his or her identity. The inability to construct the narrative logic can result in a trauma of disintegration of the self for viewer, and this is what makes the experience of this film so special and so physically traumatic for us. Language is deprived of its power not only on the level of narration, but on the level of speech as well. The important part of experience of Khrustalev is the perception of sound. The cacophony of speech, diegetic and non-diegetic music, murmur, champing, coughing, all these and other numerous sounds make the voice recognition complicated, and a spectator is forced to remain in a state of the constant tension by trying to decipher actor's voice and actor's words. This sound terror, by borrowing the expression of Jan Levchenko, almost paralyzes spectator in his understanding, in his cognitive process of information from the film. Not only polyphony, however, affects the viewer, but also dehumanization of speech. It manifests itself through degeneration of human voice and reinforcement of extra-linguistic and non-communicative sound. So in Khrustalev, My Car, we often deal with the situations when characters make inarticulate noises. They suddenly distort their intonation, and at the same time, these noises can be interrupted by poetry and dirty language. So all these features of sound horror can be found in Repentance as well, but especially, for example, when the flow of speech is quite often interrupted by music, but mostly this horror is caused by the excess of speech. It's especially obvious when we see Varlam Aravidae on the screen. He switches between languages, Georgian and Russian, and he mixes his philosophical monologues with dry, official party language. And of course, he cannot stop talking. He's always talking something. So, and this excess becomes a real cacophony of repentance. So it's a little bit different from Khrustalev, My Car. The senseless connection in the films is also achieved through specific images, as I said before. Khrustalev is a celebration of folk, love, culture in its carnival version, with its emphasis on the corporeal, on the physical. And the strongest sense, however, is disgust in this film, which is felt during the entire film. The saliva, blood, are what disturbs and functions as the object in the film, first of all. The corporeality of imagery becomes so strong here that even olfactory feelings can be aroused during the watching. And this is what mentioned in their reviews many critics. I will come back to this later. They get stronger. I mean, these feelings, olfactory feelings, get stronger in the small rooms which are full of crowds of people and clouds of steam and smoking and cigarette smoke. So by such rooms, I mean, so German creates very specific mise-en-scène in his film. It's always claustrophobic spaces. And here we see just one of the examples from this film, where we see a lot of people and they stay very close to each other. There is no any space between them. This mise-en-scene significantly influences to our sensuous perception of screen space. The most bodily uncomfortable scenes in Khrustalev are the rape of General Klenski and death of Stalin. Etkin describes his experience of the first scene as follows. The scene, he means the rape of General Klenski, is unbearably long and horrifying. It evokes a visceral response of disgust and fear. After watching the scene, we feel something similar about ourselves. This phrase, "we feel something similar about ourselves," signifies the power of this connection between the film and spectator. And at the same time, it demonstrates how painful and physically destructive this connection might be. The episode of Stalin's death becomes a shocking recreation of physical senses. It's a recreation of death without taboos and cultural restrictions, and even with some almost erotic latent reference. These two scenes become liminal spaces in the film, which are outside of ethical and cultural symbols again. Repentance provides less disturbing experience, but still it operates with the same sensuous images of death and corpse, and also images of food, which that you can see on the screen now play a significant role here. This is a quote from a review written by Boris Vasilyev, writer Boris Vasilyev, after watching Repentance. He says, "Also, there are no whips in it. In Repentance, I have the physical sensation of being scourged. After their deaths, he means dictators, decompose among the living. Their corpses stink to this day. In our own society, the fated regurgitations of great Russian chauvinism and of regional nationalism stink of that same corpse. In lieu of frosting churches, marzipan crosses, in lieu of temples, simulacra appear. Icing temples open and close the film. Sugared steeples, frosting churches, marzipan crosses, and no one protests. On the contrary, Varlam Aravidae got what he wanted. He relocated the temples from the spiritual domain to the digestive organs. So just take a look at the language Vassiliev uses here. His impressions are completely sensuous. He almost feels pain and refers to taste. So I want to emphasize here that the images we see in these films have such a strong physical influence, not only because they themselves refer to senses, but because Abuladze and German use specific cinematic techniques, such as close-ups, noticeable camera movements, quick cutting, and many other techniques, which is a topic for absolutely separate conversation here. So the spectator is engaged with the film through a whole set of sensory domains. And this radical bodily engagement is essential for the cinematically recreated memory, recreated past. Abuladze and German allow us to experience physically this painful experience of remembrance. And this is what makes these films ethically and politically powerful. So if you have any questions,